It's 2 in the morning at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, and 4 people are climbing into a supersonic bomber carrying tens of thousands of pounds of bombs, about to fly to the other side of the planet, drop them, and fly home without the engines ever shutting off. That's not an exaggeration. In February 2024, after a drone strike killed 3 American soldiers in Jordan, 2 B-1 bombers flew out of Dyess, took part in strikes on more than 85 targets across Iraq and Syria, and flew straight back to Texas. Same aircraft, same 4 crew members, same ejection seats, for roughly 34 hours straight. Crews just call it a 30-hour mission, even on the days it runs longer. So, how do 4 human beings actually survive that? And why does the answer increasingly involve women who, until 1999, weren't even legally allowed to fly this aircraft into combat? Let's get into how it actually works. Pilots call this aircraft the Bone, short for B-1, and the Air Force only keeps 45 of them flying today, split between 2 wings, one at Dyess and one at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota. The B-1 Lancer is not a fighter jet, and that difference matters more than people think. Fighter pilots fly alone or in pairs for an hour or 2, and they're home for dinner. The B-1 carries 4 people, 2 pilots up front and 2 weapon systems officers behind them, packed into a cockpit not much roomier than a minivan, strapped into ejection seats for the entire flight. There's no walking around back there. There's no bunk to lie down in like on an airliner. The aircraft can carry 75,000 pounds of bombs and missiles, more than any other bomber in the fleet, and its wings physically sweep backward for speed and forward for fuel efficiency. None of that engineering solves the actual problem though. Somebody still has to sit in that jet and stay sharp for a day and a half. These flights aren't some rare stunt. B-1 crews have been flying missions like this since the opening weeks of the war in Afghanistan in 2001, launching from the Indian Ocean toward targets more than 16 hours away. In just the first 6 months of that campaign, 8 B-1s dropped almost 40% of all the bombs used in the entire war. Once crews started flying straight out of Dyess and Ellsworth instead, the math only got harder, since there's no forward base to land at and no layover country anymore. It's just takeoff, refuel in the air, hit the target, refuel again, and land back where the day started. None of the 4 people in that cockpit got there overnight either. Becoming qualified to fly the B-1 takes years of training before a crew member ever sits through a real combat sortie, learning the aircraft's systems, the weapons, the formation tactics, and the kind of split-second teamwork that 4 strangers can't fake their way through at hour 20 of a mission. By the time someone straps into that ejection seat for an actual strike, they've already spent years earning the right to be exhausted in it. Here's what that actually looks like, hour by hour. The crew shows up for a mission brief hours before they ever touch the jet, going over coordinates, threats, weather, and a refueling schedule that's about to define their entire day. Then they strap in. Takeoff happens like any other flight, except everyone in that cockpit already knows they won't be unstrapping for over a day. The first few hours are almost boring. Cruise altitude, the autopilot doing most of the work. 2 pilots and 2 weapon systems officers settling into a rhythm they'll need to hold for the long haul. But boredom at hour 3 turns into something else entirely by hour 15. Somewhere over an ocean, in the dark, a tanker aircraft has to find this exact bomber, match its speed within feet, and push thousands of pounds of fuel through a hose the width of a fire extinguisher. Miss that rendezvous, and the mission doesn't happen. By now, the crew has been awake for the better part of a full day, and the most precise, least forgiving part of the flight is still ahead of them. Then comes the target area, where everything the crew trained for finally matters. Weapons get configured, coordinates get refined in real time, and the aircraft that's been a flying gas tank for the last 20 hours becomes for 10 or 15 minutes, the most dangerous thing in that stretch of sky. And then it's over. Bombs away, and the only thing left to do is fly all the way home, refueling at least once more along the way. That return leg is where missions like this actually get survived, or don't. Retired Lieutenant General Chris Miller, a former B-1 pilot, has described the fix as almost embarrassingly simple. Take power naps, watch your nutrition, and don't overdo the caffeine, because hitting the coffee too hard at hour 5 leaves nothing for hour 25. Right when the body wants to shut down completely. Crews have found a strange solution for actually sleeping in a cockpit too. The most comfortable spot for a nap on a B-1 isn't a seat at all. It's stretched out on top of the foam, and vinyl engine inlet covers the crew halls along for exactly that reason. And yes, there's a toilet. A small camp-style one tucked into the crew compartment because the Air Force figured out decades ago that you cannot ask 4 people to hold it for 30 hours and expect them to function. Not glamorous, but it's there. And it's one of the few comforts this aircraft actually gives its crew. By the final 2 hours, fatigue stops being an inconvenience and becomes the actual danger. The crew has been awake for over a day. They've just flown a combat strike, and now they need to fly a precision approach and put a multi-million-dollar aircraft down on a runway that doesn't get any wider just because everyone's exhausted. Pilots who've flown these missions will tell you landing scares them more than the bombing run ever did. Here's the part of this story that's changed the most over the last 25 years. None of this was even legally available to women until 1993, when the Secretary of Defense formally opened combat aviation to female pilots, the same year the Air Force trained its first female fighter pilot. 6 years later, a young pilot named Jennifer Avery earned her wings and was sent to Ellsworth to fly the B-1. In 1999, she flew 4 combat sorties over Kosovo, becoming the first woman to fly the aircraft in combat. She didn't stop there. A few years after that, she became the first woman to fly the B-2 stealth bomber in combat as well. But in interviews since, she's been clear that she never wanted her gender to be the reason anyone remembered her flying, and never wanted anyone assuming she'd gotten there because she was a woman. She wanted to be remembered for being good at the job, period. Even now, more than 30 years after that policy changed, this corner of the Air Force stays small. Out of roughly 11,000 pilots flying for the Air Force today, somewhere around 7% are women, and that number shrinks further once you narrow it down to combat aircraft specifically. However, being good at the job and being equipped for it turned out to be 2 different problems. For most of the history of American combat aviation, every piece of gear in that cockpit, the ejection seat, the flight suit, the anti-gravity suit that keeps blood from draining out of a pilot's brain during hard maneuvers, was built using body measurements taken from men back in the 1960s. A former Air Force secretary put it plainly: seats were designed for men sized somewhere between the 10th and 90th percentile, and that was just how it was. Madge. Saley Rodriguez, an Air Force engineer who worked on fixing the problem, has put it even more bluntly. Without any added gear, ejection seats used to only safely accommodate women who weighed in the 140s and up. Way less than that, and the seat meant to save your life in an emergency might not even work for your body. It got more absurd from there. Flight suit zippers weren't cut low enough for women to actually use their in-flight bladder relief devices, which sounds like a minor inconvenience until you remember these are 30-hour missions. Faced with gear that didn't fit and no real alternative, pilots did the only thing available to them. They stopped drinking water before long flights, a workaround the Air Force now openly calls tactical dehydration. One pilot, Madge. Nikki Yogi has described getting so dehydrated during a deployment flying the A-10 that she threw up in the jet and had to come home early. Yeah, you read that right. Dehydration like that doesn't just make someone uncomfortable. It can cut a pilot's tolerance for G-forces nearly in half, which on an aircraft built around hard maneuvers and ejection seats is not a small problem. So, the Air Force started fixing it, although not nearly as fast as the women flying these jets would have liked. A former chief of staff ordered a full review of flight gear back in 2018 after years of women paying out of their own pockets just to get uniforms altered to fit. Engineers eventually redesigned the anti-gravity suit so it could actually be adjusted at the waist instead of one size fits most. They began fielding new in-flight relief systems with names like Skydrate and Aeris, built around female anatomy instead of retrofitted around it after the fact. None of it happened fast, and some of these fixes only reached squadrons in the last few years. But it happened because the women already flying these missions refused to stay quiet about gear that was putting them at risk. The payoff of that pressure showed up on a single afternoon in March of 2018 at Ellsworth Air Force Base. For the first time in the history of the 34th Bomb Squadron, an entire B-1 aircrew, both pilots and both weapons systems officers, was female. Captains Lillian Pryor and Lauren Olmey flew the jet. Captain Danielle Zidak and First Lieutenant Kimberly Orton ran the weapons. It actually took pulling crew members from two squadrons, the 34th and the 37th, just to find 4 qualified women available on the same day, which says something on its own about how thin that bench still is. Before they ever left the ground, several of them talked about the women who'd made that flight possible long before they were born. Women like Amelia Earhart and the Wasps of World War II, who flew military aircraft for the United States without ever being allowed to call it combat. Zidak, who led the mission, put it simply, afterward. It was those women, she said, who'd made her confident enough to do the job she does today. We dig into stories like this every week, and if that sounds like your kind of channel, subscribe. Lauren Olmey's story didn't end on that runway either. Years later, now a major flying out of Dyess, she became one of the first people in the Department of Defense to fly a supersonic aircraft while pregnant, logging more than 9 hours in a B-1 alongside her husband, also a B-1 pilot, while their unborn child quite literally went supersonic before being born. Her husband has said since that he still isn't sure how she managed to run a unit, build training schedules, fly the jet, and grow a person, all at the same time, with the same poise she brings to everything else. It sounds like a detail somebody made up for a script. Nobody did. It's in the official record. Whether you think it took too long for the gear to catch up to the women already flying the mission, or you think the timeline doesn't matter as much as the fact that it happened at all, that's a fair argument to have. Ask anyone who's flown one of these 30-hour sorties why they keep doing it, and you'll hear some version of the same answer. It isn't the adrenaline, because for 29 of those 30 hours, there isn't much adrenaline to speak of. It's the trust. 4 people strapped into seats they can't leave, flying the most heavily armed aircraft in the American bomber fleet across an ocean and back, depending completely on each other to stay sharp for a day and a half straight. The pilots up front can't see half of what the weapons systems officers behind them are tracking, and the weapons systems officers can't fly the jet home if something goes wrong up front. There's nowhere to hide weakness in a cockpit like that. You either carry your share for 30 hours, or everyone in that aircraft knows it. For the women who had to fight just to get gear that fit their bodies, finishing that mission isn't only a job done well, it's proof the fight to get there was worth having. That's really what these missions are about, underneath the bombs and the fuel math. The B-1's whole value to the Air Force is that it can do all of this without needing a base anywhere near the target, taking off from American soil and coming home to it. That's also why these bombers keep showing up wherever the Air Force needs to make a point, even now, with a newer stealth bomber called the B-21 Raider already in testing to eventually replace them. In January of 2025, B-1s flew clear across the Pacific to Guam under a lieutenant colonel named Vanessa Wilcox, who didn't just fly the mission, she commanded it. The same role that used to be legally off limits to women 30 years ago, now sometimes has a woman in charge of the entire deployment. The quieter story here, the one that took 30 years longer to write than the engineering did, is that the people flying these missions no longer have to look like they did when the aircraft first rolled out in 1985. They just have to be tough enough to survive the seat. The B-1 started as a Cold War bomber built to slip past Soviet radar at treetop height. It ended up as something the engineers who designed it probably never pictured. A 40-year-old aircraft still flying the longest, hardest missions in the Air Force, with women filling every seat in the cockpit, and now leading some of the missions from the ground as well. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet.